The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Sporty's webinar series. This evening, an exciting topic, an exciting presentation we have on drone flying, and of course the new Part 107 regulations. Very excited to have with us as our presenter, literally the person who helped write the book on Part 107, and that's Don Shinneman from Unmanned Safety Institute, and we're going to hear more from Don in just a moment. A few housekeeping items from the Sporty side. My name's Eric Radke, and I'm serving as your facilitator for the evening. If you do have to step away, or if you miss a particular point that was made in the presentation, not to worry. We are recording the entire presentation, and we do make these presentations available in the Sporty's webinar archive at sportys.com/webinar. So likely the same place you came to register for the webinar, you can come back and find the webinar archives and all those recordings, and you can also take a look at future presentations. The recording should be available in just a couple of days. The drone market, to the topic at hand. What was once reserved for military applications, and then later on the hobbyist, the modelist, it seems like almost overnight has become mainstream. It's rare to come across a person who either isn't flying some type of a drone or small UAS, or maybe you have one yourself. We tend these days to even blur the lines between the recreational and hobbyist and all these applications that venture on the side of commercial operations, and that's what, of course, the new Part 107 has helped to define. Without further ado, let me introduce you to our presenter for the evening. Don Shinneman, as I mentioned, serves as an instructor at the Unmanned Safety Institute and has over a decade of unmanned aircraft industry experience. Before venturing into the UAS industry, Mr. Shinneman had a distinguished career in public safety, last serving as the Chief of Police for the city of Port St. Lucie, Florida. Mr. Shinneman served as the chair of the Aviation Committee of the International Association of Chiefs of Police for over 15 years, and in 2008, as I mentioned, having written the book, he was selected to serve on the historic first FAA rulemaking committee to draft regulatory language to integrate small unmanned aircraft systems into the national airspace system that eventually became FAA Part 107. Mr. Shinneman holds a master's degree in business administration from the University of Baltimore, and he's also an active commercial pilot for both helicopters, airplanes, and of course unmanned aircraft. Don, we certainly appreciate you being here with us, and very intrigued to have you lead us through this evolution in the emerging markets that drones present. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk about something that has become my passion over the last decade or so, and that's the integration of unmanned aircraft into the national airspace system. And I know we have a very diverse group with us tonight. I suspect we have a fair number of hobbyists, a fair number of people who are exploring the possibility of entering the commercial side of the unmanned aircraft world. Everything that I'm going to present tonight, I think, is scalable. The first thing, obviously, we're going to talk about is the regulatory environment for hobbyists and for commercial operations under Part 107. I'll share with you some observations on safety systems, and again, all scalable, whether you're a hobbyist just going out in your backyard and you're going to fly your DJI Phantom around, or perhaps you're doing it as a realtor to take photographs of houses for sale. Everything I'm going to talk about is scalable. I'm also going to not spend a lot of time, but talk about some observations about where the commercial market stands today. It's a whole new industry. And a very exciting time to be not only as part of that industry, but very exciting to be part of the next generation of aviation. By all accounts, the days of our leather flying jackets and white silk scarves are numbered, unless you're going to wear them inside of an air-conditioned control room somewhere. But it is the beginning of the next great generation of aviation. So why don't we get started here? And by the way, I was part of the rulemaking committee that led to Part 107. So if you have objections to Part 107, please feel free to send Eric a question, and perhaps I can talk to you about why certain things happened in that when we were developing the rule. The objectives tonight are twofold. First is to understand the current regulatory framework for UAS operations, and I use the term UAS as opposed to drone. We gave up many years ago trying to get people to call them unmanned systems, and have accepted the term drone, but for me it's a hard habit to break, so I'll use UAS operations. And to understand how to conduct safe UAS operations, again, whether you're a commercial provider or a hobbyist. Here is probably the most basic thing that everyone has to understand. Even again, if you're flying your DJI Phantom in your backyard, you are part of aviation. As a UAS operator, whether it's a model aircraft or you're a commercial service provider, you have a responsibility to keep the skies safe. And what I found over the last 10 years, in particular since I left police work and began my second career in unmanned aviation, is there are lots of folks who understand the technology. There are fewer folks that understand how to operate a business, and there are also very few people that understand, unless they come with an aviation background, there are few people to understand that unmanned aviation is a part of aviation. It's all of our responsibility to keep the national airspace system safe. Let's talk about the regulatory environment. Of course, the regulator is the Federal Aviation Administration, who by charter are tasked with developing and enforcing air traffic rules, certifying both airmen and aircraft, registering aircraft, and primarily maintaining a national airspace system with controllers, navigation aids, and service facilities to promote safety within the national airspace system. The history of regulation by the FAA of unmanned aircraft, if we can call it that, goes back to the early 2000s when the FAA began to use national policy documents to regulate UAS operations. There were two methods at that time to get authorization for UAS operations: a special airworthiness certificate, and for public aircraft operators, those operated by governments, was to get a certificate of authorization to fly in the national airspace system, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The legality or the enforceability of the national policy documents was frequently challenged, and insiders at the FAA would admit it was blue smoke and mirrors back then. They really had no regulatory authority to regulate UAS, and that took quite a long time for them to move that forward. In 2008, the FAA chartered the very first rulemaking committee to develop rules, to recommend rules to integrate UAS into the national airspace system. That was a group that I was part of. We completed our work in April of 2009, and as most of us know, the final rule was published in the Federal Register June 28th, 2016, with an effective date of August 29th, 2016. That was over 7 years later. When we completed our work in April of 2009, the actual timeline was for the FAA to vet our recommendations and within 12 months do the regulatory process and publish in the Federal Register. Obviously, that didn't happen. Lots of bad things happened in those 7 years. People just kind of did what they wanted. And then finally, the FAA published a rule in 2016, which is where we are today. The rule actually did more than just create Part 107. It revised Part 21 certification, Part 43 maintenance, Part 61 airman certification, Part 91 general operating and flight rules for you hobbyists, Part 101 balloons, rockets, and model aircraft were revised, and then it did create Part 107, small unmanned aircraft systems. For Part 101, and I won't read you all those numbers, but it says that a model aircraft is one that is flown strictly for hobby or recreational purposes. That's critical. If you may consider yourself a hobbyist, but if you're offering yourself out to a local real estate agency, you're no longer flying for hobby or recreational purposes. You're now a commercial operator. That goes back to the early 2000s when the FAA had a policy of toy versus tool. If you were using it as a toy, as a hobby, then there was a advisory circular 9157 that gave you guidance on how to operate. If you were flying it as a tool, then you had to go either by the special airworthiness certificate or as a public entity get a certificate of authorization. Part 101 now requires that for hobby or recreational purposes, the aircraft is operated in accordance with community-based set of safety guidelines and within the programming of a nationwide community-based organization. That's very important. The word nationwide implies that you can't be a local-based group. It's a nationwide community-based organization. When I sat on the rulemaking committee, I was the only public safety representative. There were about 20 of us on that committee, and there were about, well, like I said, I was the only public safety representative. There were 2 representatives from the Academy of Model Aeronautics on that committee, and within the first hour of the first meeting of our rulemaking committee, we were told by the FAA we could make no recommendation that would change what AMA already had in place to govern hobbyist use of UAS or radio-controlled airplanes, they used to be referred to as. Part 101 also says that the aircraft cannot be more than 55 pounds unless, again, certified by a community-based organization. I'm amazed. I'm not a RC modelist, but was amazed when I started doing Google searches and I saw 4-engine bomber, World War II replica bombers, and really large planes, jet turbine-powered planes that can go vertical at a very high speed. Truly amazing aircraft, really exciting to watch. But if it's more than 55 pounds, it has to be certified by, again, a community-based organization. Part 101 requires that the aircraft, the model aircraft, does not interfere with and must give way to manned aircraft at all times, of course. This is an interesting one that we'll talk about again when we start talking about Part 107. But when you're flying within 5 miles of an airport, you have to provide prior notice to the airport operator or air traffic control facility at that airport, should they have one. Pay particular attention to the words provide prior notice, because it's much different under Part 107 for non-hobbyist use. Provide prior notice. There's really not much guidance on what constitutes prior notice, whether or how much time you have to give, whether that could be something taped to the door of the airport manager's office or written notification or telephone call or whatever. But the only requirement, again, is to provide prior notice, not approval. So to recap Part 101 for model aircraft, hobby or recreation, must be in compliance with community-based programs and standards, 55-pound maximum, give way to manned aircraft. Within 5 miles of an airport, you must give prior notice. No FAA pilot certification. So if you're complying with that, Part 107 does not apply to your operation. The community-based organization that is always referred to in the discussions with the FAA is, again, the Academy of Model Aeronautics. That is their website address, modelaircraft.org. It's an organization of, at last count, somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 members. And without getting political, they've got a lot of drag politically. That's why they had 2 members, and all of public safety had 1, and we were told up front again that we couldn't do anything to interfere with what AMA had in place. The two guys who were on the group on the committee were great guys, and that is a very well managed organization, and their policies and procedures that are in place are really solid from a safety perspective. So my suggestion is, if you're not already, and if you're a hobbyist and you're not an AMA member, I would suggest that you do so. Okay, let's switch to part 107, titled Small Unmanned Aircraft System. There are 4 parts: A, B, C, and D: general operating rules, remote pilot certification, and the waiver process. The whole thing, as published in the Federal Register, is only 24 pages long. I had it figured out at one time how many years that was per page, and the math eludes me at the moment, but 7 years and a 24-page rule. Applicability: civil UAS only, does not apply to public UAS operations. I don't know if we have any government UAS operators here, but Part 107 does not apply to public aircraft operations, and I have a slide later on where we'll talk about that. Certainly doesn't apply to air carrier operations for obvious reasons. It doesn't apply to any operations subject to Part 101, specifically model aircraft. And there was a process after the 2012 FAA Reauthorization Act that came up. It was actually Section 333 of the FAA Reauthorization Act that allowed the FAA to approve operations in anticipation of these rules be putting into place. And there were thousands of 333 exemptions that were authorized by the FAA, and as long as they're still in effect, the remote pilot and command RPIC can still operate under a 333 exemption if they so choose. Definition: a small unmanned aircraft, same with hobbyists, less than 55 pounds, which includes everything on board or attached, such as sensors or cameras. Whatever is attached must be less than 55 pounds. There's now a reporting requirement. 10 days, if no later than 10 days after the operation, the remote pilot and command must report to the FAA any operation that involves serious injury or loss of consciousness, damage to any property other than the aircraft involving cost to repair over $500, or total loss of property exceeding $500. So again, not including the aircraft itself. If there's damage over $500, serious injury or loss of consciousness, you have to report to the FAA within 10 days. There's a requirement that the operator hold a remote pilot certificate, but they allow for the RPIC to have a person that's manipulating the flight controls. If that person is under the direct supervision of the RPIC and has the ability to immediately take control of the controls from the person manipulating the flight controls. So somebody there has to have a remote pilot certificate, but somebody else can actually fly the aircraft. In my private business, I do work for manufacturers, and more than once I've been the remote pilot in command, but an actual factory representative with much greater skills with the aircraft has served as the person manipulating the flight controls. But for the record, I was the RPIC and I was legally responsible for the flight. 107.13 requires that the aircraft must be registered, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The RPIC must check the SUAS to determine whether it is in condition for safe flight. That is the only concession to airworthiness that you'll find in Part 107. There are no airworthiness standards for the design or manufacturer of unmanned aircraft, so the RPIC by regulation must check to make sure that the whole system, which would include the data link, the ground control station, whether that's a handheld controller or a more complex system, the RPIC is responsible for certifying that the aircraft, the whole system, is in condition for flight. Again, no other airworthiness requirements other than that. No person may participate in the operation if they have a physical or mental condition that would interfere with the safe operation. That takes place of the medical certificate for traditional manned pilots. So there is the concession to the medical certificate, and that's however you choose to define that. But you have to, should it come to that, you would have to say, yes, I was in physical and mental condition for the flight. Of course, there could be no careless or reckless operation of the aircraft. Operation from moving vehicle or aircraft. It's prohibited to operate a UAS from another aircraft. You can operate from a moving vehicle if the operation is a sparsely populated aircraft. Not uncommon, especially for utility inspections, to use a small unmanned aircraft over a distance to check, say, a power transmission line over miles. And you can do that legally under Part 107 if you from a moving vehicle, but it's got to be in a sparsely populated area. The picture there is a U.S. Geological Service study where they were going to check a large area. They were going to operate from the airboat that you see there, and I think that would fit the definition of a sparsely populated area. Same alcohol and drugs as manned aircraft. There's no difference there. 9117, 9119, 8 hours from bottle to throttle. 0.04% blood alcohol content, and no dangerous drugs prohibited. Daylight operations only. You may operate during civil twilight. If you're pilots, you know that that's 30 minutes before or after sunrise, sunset, but you have to have anti-collision lighting that's visible for 3 statute miles. So essentially it's daytime operations and sunrise and sunset if you have anti-collision lights. Visual line of sight at all times. You must be able to see the aircraft during its entire flight, the location, attitude, altitude, and direction of flight. The reason for that, and I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, where we are with the state of the technology. We don't have sense and avoid technology where there would be an onboard system that can automatically detect other objects in the sky and automatically deconflict with that. So for manned pilots, you know that we're responsible to see and avoid other objects in the sky. So with visual line of sight, the burden is put on the remote pilot in command to always be able to see the aircraft so that it can see and avoid and deconflict other objects that may in the sky to avoid a collision hazard. Visual line of sight, very, very important, and it's also the limiting factor of full integration of unmanned aircraft into the national airspace system. The common belief is that it's the FAA. It is not the FAA. It's just the state of the technology. We don't have automatic sense and avoid technology. It's not required. It has been in the past, but it's not required to have a visual observer. If used, you must be able to maintain effective communication with the remote pilot in command at all times. And the visual observer has to be able at all times to see the location, the attitude, the altitude, and the direction of flight of the aircraft. So what you see in that picture is there's the remote pilot in command manipulating the controls on the left. He's got a visual observer standing within talking distance and also with a radio, so that both eyes are on the aircraft, but the pilot may look down at the controller, and then the visual observer's primary responsibility is to, again, always maintain visual line of sight of the aircraft. Control of multiple aircraft can only control one at a time. And it's quite possible with technology and more sophisticated systems to fly more than one aircraft at a time from a ground control station, but by regulation, you're only allowed one at a time. Operation over people, prohibited unless they are directly participating in the operation that's being conducted with with the unmanned aircraft. A good example of that is at a fire scene, a structure fire, let's say. You can put an unmanned aircraft up over that structure, and the firefighters and police officers who are there working that event are considered participating in the operation, so it's legal to overfly them. If you're in a park and you're flying over people on a playground that are not participating in the operation of the unmanned aircraft, that is prohibited by Part 107. Another big one is no operations are permitted in Class B, C, D airspace. They don't even address Class A because there are very few under 55 pounds that can go up to 18,000 feet, or within the lateral boundaries of Class E airspace designated for an airport. And you remember when I was saying that for model aircraft, it's all you have to give is prior notice. For Part 107 operators, you must have prior authorization from the air traffic control facility to operate within that airspace. That is at the moment the most sought after waiver, and it's also extremely difficult to get sheerly by volume. I was talking to some folks from the FAA at a conference about a month ago. I think there were 700 or 800 waiver requests that were pending, and that's probably a low number. And they're just overwhelmed at the moment with waiver requests, but the process is you have to have prior authorization from air traffic control to enter B, C, D, or the lateral boundaries of Class E where it's designated for an airport. For Class G airspace, you need no approval. You can buy and fly, so they say. You can just go and operate in Class G airspace. For those not familiar with the sectional chart, and believe me, this took me some time to find an airport that had Class E airspace all the way to the surface. This is St. Simon's Island in Georgia, and it is represented on a sectional with a dotted magenta line around. So that Class E airspace would go, instead of 700 or 1,200 feet, that would go all the way to the surface. And of course, that's what Class G airspace looks like. Most of the airspace in the U.S. is Class G, especially down low where we would be operating. So we have a lot of airspace we can operate in legally. The FAA has an app that you can get for Android or iPhones. It's called Before You Fly app. It's free, gives you guidance on current airspace, where you're going to try to operate from, planning devices, and more. This is actually where I am sitting right now, which is just south of Flagler Beach in Florida. Daytona Beach is just south of me. And as you can see, if I wanted to go out in my front yard and fly something, I'm legal to do that. There is a tower-controlled airport not too far from me, but I am outside the boundary of that airspace. Now, the next slide, I happen to be in Dallas, Texas over the weekend, and I was at that spot there, and as you can see, it's actually just north and west of DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth International, and the airspace there, it popped up really quickly and told me that I could not fly in that space. So it is a great app to get a quick read on whether or not you're legal to fly where you're at. Again, it's just simply Before You Fly, and that's a pretty easy depiction of what it looks, what it will tell you when you go out and you want to fly. But much different between that one there and very complicated airspace just north and west of DFW Airport. Most of those airport and heliport designators are private airports. There are actually no tower-controlled airports around there, but or in the immediate vicinity of where I was, but some pretty complicated airspace. Speed and altitude, 400 feet AGL. Maximum forward speed, 87 knots. There is a provision that you can operate 400 feet and a radius of 400 feet out from a vertical object, whether that's a building or what is depicted there is a wind turbine used to generate electricity. So if say you're on the top of one of those wind turbines, you could go 400 feet above the top of the wind turbine and 400 feet out. Again, as long as you're maintaining visual line of sight at all times of the aircraft. Apologize for that. Distance from clouds, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet lateral, and you must have 3 statute miles of visibility. Again, the whole intent here is to deconflict with manned aircraft, and until we see sense and avoid technology, we're not going to see full integration, and it really limits the utility of the technology. But until we have that piece, there's no way to guarantee the safety of the national airspace system. I'll talk about ADS-B. You often hear ADS-B is the panacea to that problem, but I'll talk about that in a minute. It creates a remote pilot certificate, and you must be 16, able to read, write, speak English. You have to be vetted by the Transportation Security Agency. For a Part 61 rated pilot, very easy process to get a UAS pilot certificate. You have to have, your biannual has to be current. You pass an online exam. You get a logbook endorsement from a CFI that verifies that your biannual is current. And then you go on IACRA on the FAA website, and they'll send you your UAS pilot certificate. It's actually a separate card, and not like the one that's depicted here. On the right-hand side of the front of the card are the letters UAS very prominently down the right side of the card, but it looks just like any other pilot certificate, except it's for remote pilots. If you are not currently a Part 61 rated pilot, you have to pass an initial aeronautical knowledge exam at a testing center. So you can do an online study program, you can self-study, but you must go to one of the 2 authorized testing centers and pay the fee to take the written exam. And then you can, of course, get this pilot certificate. There's no practical exam, no medical requirement. You have to self-certify that you have no physical or mental condition that would interfere with safety. And both groups, current pilots or already rated Part 61 pilots or new UAS pilots, must retake the exam every 24 months. Waivers. This is the stumbling block at the moment. A waiver authorizing deviation is possible if you can prove that you can do it safely as determined by the FAA. Folks that I talked to there said the biggest problem is people are requesting waivers and not making a case that they can do it safely. For nighttime operations, the only thing that the FAA is requiring at the moment is anti-collision lights, and they are requiring a visual observer. So during daylight operations, a visual observer is optional. At nighttime, they're requiring a visual observer and anti-collision light. So it's not incredibly complicated. Again, you have to maintain visual line of sight. That's what the anti-collision lights are for. But there is quite a backlog on waivers, and it's taken a while to do those. These are the things that are subject to waiver: operation from a vehicle or aircraft, daylight, visual line of sight, visual observer, multiple aircraft, yielding right away, operations over people. Airspace is the biggest request they're getting, and operating limitations for small unmanned aircraft. They're not getting many of those. Operating over people is also a difficult one to make a safety case for. Nighttime and airspace are the big ones at the moment. Unfortunately, it's taken, I think, 60 days at least to get a waiver for those things. Part 107 recap. Any non-hobby or recreation operation falls or any non-hobby or recreation operations covered by Part 107. You have to have a remote pilot and command certificate under 55 pounds, Class G and Class E, unless within the surface area of an airport, you're fine to go and fly. Day, 400 feet AGL, and not over people. Public aircraft, again, if we have any government, perhaps public safety operators here, Part 101 addresses model aircraft, and Part 107 civil operations. Public aircraft are those operated by governments and require a certificate of authorization from the FAA. There are pros and cons to going that route. I can tell you that in the industry, we recommend that government agencies start with Part 107. Government agencies can elect to comply with Part 107 and operate as a civil aircraft. The COA process, again, is complicated. They require training and standard operating procedures, which are all good things, but the process is still a bit cumbersome. So we think the best way to go is Part 107 if you're a government operator. Part 48 was added to the FARs in 2015 and applies to any small unmanned aircraft that weighs over 0.55 pounds. Again, any small unmanned aircraft that weighs over 0.55 pounds must be registered. Model aircraft had to comply by February 19th, 2016. Non-model aircraft by 3/31/16. I have no idea why the two different dates. Must be 13 to register, and there's a $5 excuse me, a $5 fee to register. For non-model aircraft, every aircraft must be registered. So if you're operating under Part 107, you have to have every aircraft must be registered. If you're a model aircraft operator, you can get one certificate, and it doesn't matter how many aircraft that you're flying, as long as you own them. You get one certificate, and it applies to all the aircraft that you own. The aircraft registration number must be affixed to the aircraft, be legible, readily accessible. If it's in a compartment on the aircraft, and I'll give you an example of that in a second, it must be accessible without tools, such as, this is an example of how to label your UAS. It can be engraved, it can be a permanent label, it can be a permanent marker. Some of the systems I'm familiar with, it's in the battery compartment. Again, if it's in a compartment, yeah, it has to be accessible without the use of tools, and the batteries on those just snap in and they snap out, so there's no tools, and that's a good place to put the registration number. Something else to consider, you know, the FAA is the primary regulator for the national airspace system, but state and local governments have jumped on the bandwagon, started a few years ago when UAS started to become popular, in particular with law enforcement agencies. And many states and local jurisdictions have in fact passed laws to regulate UAS. At first, the focus was on law enforcement and privacy. The focus today has really shifted. Fortunately, as a culture, we have a short attention span. The focus has shifted to inappropriate use by hobbyists and the protection of critical infrastructure. So every operator should be aware not just of AMA's guidelines if you're a hobbyist, or Part 107 requirements of the FAA, but you should be aware of any state or local regulations before you decide to go fly. Okay, let's talk about unmanned aircraft safety operations, and here is where this is completely scalable to the type of operation that you're doing. Even hobbyists have to pay some passing attention to the safety of their operations. Now, safety programs can vary greatly. I worked for Boeing Unmanned Systems for 5 years. We flew military-grade technology at 18,000 feet. We had extensive safety programs, as opposed to somebody, again, who's got the DJI Phantom and wants to go fly in their backyard. Well, where you still need to consider certain aspects of safety before you go and fly. So remember, we're all part of the national airspace system. We're all aviators. We need to commit to a culture of safety. We put safety above, this is kind of for commercial operators, we put safety above profits and projected timelines. Work to build experience and knowledge in the system as you operate. I'm going to talk about that again in a minute. Establish, train, and be accountable to standard operating procedures that can mitigate the effects of human error. And while as a hobbyist you may not have standard operating procedures, but you should be trained and accountable for the risks that you may present by operating in the national airspace system. Again, all scalable. And this coming from police work, we heard this every day, liability. Any aviation operation, whether it's manned, unmanned, hobbyist, commercial, exposes you to potential liability for damage to property, injury to people, disruption of services, and invasion of privacy. There's lots of great YouTube videos of people using UAS to peep in their neighbors' windows, just really to demonstrate the capabilities. In a lot of states, that's a crime. It's called video voyeurism. So getting back to the slide about making sure you're not violating any state or local laws, even if you're just doing it to demonstrate the capabilities of what your DJI can do or your small unmanned system can do, we're all liable for our actions. Let's talk very quickly about the safety ecosystem, mission, crawl, walk, run, the system, maintenance, operational procedures, safety management system, crew, and education and training. The mission, it's what you're going to do, whether it's fun to firefighting, impacts everything that follows. For a real estate mission, aerial photography of houses for sale. The system required is a small quadcopter, minimal pilot training and experience, compliance with established regulations for this type of operation. I did a presentation about a year ago to a group of realtors in the Orlando, Florida area. And the one gentleman came up to me after my presentation and said, look, I got my RPIC certificate. He was one of the first to get it. He wanted to do things right. But the area where he sold houses was within the surface area of Orlando International Airport. So he had made a decision, even though he had requested a waiver, it hadn't been approved. He was going to go do his thing anyway because he figured he wasn't going to be flying high enough to be, he wasn't on the approach or departure end of the runway. So he figured he was good. So I asked him about the security of the data link between his controller and the aircraft. And without going too far down this rabbit hole in the technology, but most of them operate on unlicensed 900 megahertz bands. So do garage door openers, baby monitors, you name it, they all operate on 900 megahertz. So somebody can be pulling into their garage, hit their garage door opener and take control of your UAS. So the real estate guy who thinks he's not bothering anything, if he has a flyaway where he loses the command and control link and it flies away, it may very well end up on the departure or approach end of the runway. So all of these things, there's reasons why regulations are in place and safety is the primary reason. So you have to weigh the risks with the liability. My advice to him was to cut it out. For wildland firefighting, medium altitude, long endurance system with electro-optical and IR cameras and radio relay payloads to monitor fires 24 hours a day. Obviously a much more complex mission requiring everything else that we talk about in the safety ecosystem is much more complicated for that type of an operation. Crawl, walk, run, and I think I spelled crawl, walk, run, or crawl incorrectly. I think there's an L there. Be conservative. Gain essential knowledge and experience and expand as technology and markets evolve. For hobbyists, you don't buy an aircraft one day and start competitive drone racing the next. You gain experience with your system and work yourself up to competitive drone racing. So it's important, it's critical, gain essential knowledge with whatever you're doing, gain essential knowledge and experience before you increase what you're doing. System considerations, mission driven, fixed wing versus vertical takeoff and landing, liquid fuel versus battery power, what kind of sensors are you going to need, the maturity of the manufacturer. This is a brand new industry. There are hundreds of manufacturers of unmanned aircraft. Most will not be around in another year. It's the nature of the industry. So if you're investing in a system to do expensive commercial operations, take a look at the maturity of your manufacturer and the level of support that you can expect from that manufacturer. Are they going to provide training, parts, whatever? Maintenance, essential to safe operations, the aircraft, the ground control station controller, the hardware, the software. Training for those who are going to maintain your system. Are you going to turn the screws on your system, or are you going to upgrade the software? All things that have to be considered. And again, hobbyists are included in everything here to a degree. Operational procedures. For any commercial operation, you should have some sort of procedures in place, instructions and guidance, especially if it's not just you operating the system. This you hear a lot about in manned aviation, the safety management system, and it's a way to manage and assess risk. It's to determine what the risks are for every flight. Even if you're a hobbyist, are you going to take a look at the weather before you go fly? Are there thunderstorms in the area? Are the winds too great? You have to look at what the risks are and then mitigate those to an acceptable level. Frankly, if you're a hobbyist, you're going to fly in a park, there's thunderstorms in the area, there's winds. The way to mitigate that is simply not to fly. There are 4 basic pillars of SMS: safety policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion, all scalable to the size of the operation. And like I've said several times, even hobbyists can and should assess risk before flying. The crew, having the right people in place during operations, including yourself, includes such factors as aviation background, experience with unmanned aircraft, expertise in the mission, and the total number of crew necessary to complete the mission. Depending on the system, I mentioned the Boeing system, that had a fairly large crew to operate, as opposed to a hobbyist who just takes their system out and launches and flies. Education and training, certification training in the system can be initial and recurrent, safety training, maintenance training, all important factors to consider for safe operations. When combined, all of these factors provide UAS operators, whether the hobbyist or professional, a scalable program that will facilitate a safe flight. And frankly, that's what it's all about for all of us, whether we're flying manned, unmanned, professional, or hobbyist. It's all about facilitating safe flight. Now, some of my personal observations on the state of the UAS technology and the commercial market, current commercial market opportunities. As I've mentioned, full integration of UAS will not occur until sense and avoid technology is developed. Then it has to be certified, and that will allow beyond visual line of sight operations. When I got involved in the industry back in about 2004, it was the holy grail then. It remains the holy grail. ADS-B, for those of you who are familiar with ADS-B, it's automatic dependent surveillance in and out. That is touted as one solution to the problem. The problem with that is, if you're familiar with transponders on manned aircraft, there are many exemptions to aircraft that don't have to have a transponder. The same applies to ADS-B. The result is you can never guarantee that the term that's used is cooperating and non-cooperating aircraft. If an aircraft has a transponder, it's called cooperating. If it doesn't, it's not cooperating. And again, legally, regulatory-wise, there's lots of exemptions to both. So there's no guarantee that an unmanned aircraft flying beyond visual line of sight doesn't detect a transponder or an ADS-B signal, and could very well have a conflict with a manned aircraft. And until like I said earlier, until that technology is designed and certified and miniaturized to go on all unmanned aircraft, we're going to be stuck for the most part with visual line of sight. I mentioned that the visual line of sight is waiverable. It's sort of a misnomer. The FAA has announced they've given waivers for beyond visual line of sight. The aircraft itself is never beyond the visual line of sight of a human being. What they're allowing is the daisy chaining of observers. So right now, the observer has to be, for all intent and purposes, either the remote pilot in command or someone standing right there with the remote pilot in command. What they're allowing are visual line observers to be out of the visual line of sight of the remote pilot and communicating by radio. But the aircraft itself is never beyond visual line of sight of a human being. And again, we're not going to see that until we get sense and avoid technology. And I've heard projections that go to 2020 and beyond. I don't think there's anything on the immediate horizon. There are big companies spending big money because, again, when that happens, we will truly see full integration and the true beginning of the next great generation of aviation. So for the industry, as with any new industry, and this is a brand new industry, it's very exciting, entrepreneurs have rushed in to find their niche. The market is now seeing the next phase, which is many of those new businesses are struggling or dropping out, especially given the state of the technology. People rushed in expecting to capitalize on their investment and to reap big money, and it's simply not happening. The Chinese version, there's the trade organization for unmanned aircraft is called the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International. The Chinese version of that predicts that 70% of the UAS businesses that are in business today will not be in business by 2018. And I think that's probably pretty accurate. There is limited revenue to be gained there, but there's so many businesses that are trying to get a part of that. The return on investment just isn't there, and even established companies are struggling with so much competition in the marketplace for the scarce dollars that are there to be made. And I also mentioned this earlier, that it's complicated by the fact that many people know technology but don't know aviation or business fundamentals. I talk to people all the time who want to start a business, and they want my thoughts on how to start a business. And my first question is, what is your product? And you'd be surprised how many people haven't thought it through that far. They know they've got a system and they can fly it and they can do things with it. They have no idea what they want to do with it. So my theory is success will come to those who have a solid, well-developed business plan and do not need immediate return on investment. Start small, gain the experience that we talked about, and grow with the industry. A lot of people have invested a lot of money in the industry, and I don't think they did their due diligence, and they're finding that their expectations for return are not being met. And like I said, there's a lot of companies that are struggling, especially with investors who had an expectation of expectations of immediate revenue. It's just not there, unfortunately. Okay. Eric, through all my rantings, did anybody have any questions?
Don, thanks so much. A lot of great information, and it's a fantastic way to culminate there with some of your personal insight. We appreciate all that experience and expertise in that regard. Yes, a number of questions. So the way I will, I guess, format it, I'll try to organize it. Questions related to recreational flyers, questions related to the Part 107 ops, and then some kind of catch-all. So we'll go back to the very beginning and some of your discussion related to recreational UAS use. So number one question, there seems to be a little confusion out there in the audience with respect to whether it is the requirement is specifically notice when you're going to be flying within 5 miles of an airport, or whether it's you need to receive permission in order to fly within 5 miles. Can you clarify or elaborate on that piece?
Yeah, Part 101 as revised was pretty clear, and it only requires prior notice. Again, there's not much definition or guidance on what that entails, but you're only required to give prior notice. You do not need their permission. So, although I would suggest that it's not a bad idea to get that, but there are many AMA fields that operate within the surface area of airports. So, obviously they've worked out procedures to do that. They've peacefully coexisted for many years, but very, very clearly, it only requires prior notice for hobbyists. Part 107 operators must have prior authorization to operate in BC D airspace, or that surface area of a Class C airport.
And another question related to the notification. There's an audience member that that kind of wants to get your take on whether a blanket notification would be acceptable. Like, I'm going to be flying, within 3 miles of the airport in this general location, pretty much from here to eternity type blanket notification.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great idea. If you could meet with airport management and however you're doing it, like the Academy of Model Aeronautics. Again, many of their fields are located within the surface area of tower-controlled airports, so they've worked out the procedures for how to do that. So if you can find a cooperative airport manager and have some sort of discussion and come with rules, and they're probably going to require that before you actually go fly, you call someone. I think that's a great idea. I would commit that to writing, by the way. With exactly what's been agreed to, but I think that's a great way to do business.
Okay, great. One, and I think you just touched on it actually a moment ago, but I'll bring it up one more time. Just a clarification on if you're a recreational user, it is still required that you gain permission for operating within the surface area of controlled airspace in the B, C, D, and E down to the surface. Is that correct?
And well, again, it says prior notice. You technically don't need authorization to fly there. It just says you have to notify them. Only 107 operators need authorization to operate. If you're operating as a hobbyist, prior notice. So however you feel that is adequate, of course it depends on the airport. However you feel that you've taken care of that adequately, but it only requires prior notice, not authorization from air traffic control or the airport manager to operate there.
A person in the audience brings up the good point about the number of, especially in the heavy populated areas, the number of hospital heliports. And one person points out that these hospital heliports are showing up on the Before You Can Fly app and kind of giving an indication that you should, be giving notice. Can you speak to specifically the hospital heliports and many of the, larger urban areas?
Yeah, if you remember that slide that I showed with the area around DFW, there were a lot of helipads there. They're mostly at medical facilities, and you have to treat them the same as you would an airport. So you would have to give prior notice. If you want a real eye-opening video, there's a YouTube video, and I don't have the site for exactly the name of it, but there's a great, very well done video of a EMS helicopter landing on a hospital helipad, and its tail rotor is taken out by a small unmanned aircraft. It crashes on the helipad. It's, again, very well done. And the very last thing you see is a little boy with a remote control in his hand looking up with a shocked look on his face. EMS, any EMS police helipad, that's operating in an urban environment, you have to treat that as if it's an airport, and those operations, especially EMS operations, are just critical.
Excellent. Related to Part 107 users in the pursuit of a waiver, is there a location where individuals can find examples of waiver requests? Are those all available in the public domain?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. I know you do the waiver request on the FAA's website. I've actually done one myself. It's a pretty uncomplicated process, but I don't know if they have samples. It seems to make sense they would. There's been a whole change of culture in the last decade with the mindset of the FAA's Unmanned Aircraft Program Office. But Eric, I'll ask. I have friends at the FAA. I can ask that, and perhaps they could follow up, or you could post that information somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. And then kind of I guess we'll close with a question I think that affects everyone. Great question. And it's essentially whether you're, hobbyist user or whether you're Part 107 or kind of go in between. Do you have some recommendations on how people stay current and up to date with both the community standards, with what might be evolving in Part 107? Where are the good destinations or good sources of information to continue to, examine?
I think the Academy of Model Aeronautics is great for hobbyists. The AUVSI, the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International website, is also very good. They're probably the two best. There are several UAS websites that are constantly tracking changes. The FAA has, you can sign up on the FAA website for news alerts from the FAA, and it seems like every day they're putting out some sort of news flash about changes to unmanned aircraft, not necessarily rules, but recently they just created a large number of restricted areas around military infrastructure. So that frankly is probably the one I rely on the most, is the FAA News Alerts. But for hobbyists, I can't recommend enough is to become active in the Academy of Model Aeronautics, whether you actually join one of their chapters or at the very least you follow their established policies and procedures for how to operate and where and under what guidelines. So AMA, absolutely. And AUVSI for Part 107 operators. They are the advocate for unmanned aircraft operations.
Excellent. That was a quick hour, Don. We cannot thank you enough to both you, the Unmanned Safety Institute, for your expertise, for being with us. Let me share with you that a big portion of the audience is sent in via the question software. Their compliments to you for all the great information. I'm sure people will be checking back for the recorded version. Let me remind everyone that the broadcast will be available in the coming day or two at sporties.com/webinars. And again, thank you on behalf of Sporties to everyone out there in the audience for joining us. With that, for Don Scheneman and Unmanned Safety Institute, I'm Eric Radke from Sporties. Thank you all for being here with us this evening. Hope to see you back on another webinar presentation in the very near future. And everyone, please have a great night.